Okay, so hello. I'm just giving a quick overview on how the ambient systems all work together in Orca to make a realistic feel to the world. I'm gonna start basically with what we have as our three primary controllers. We have a controller for all ambience above the water. We have a controller for all ambience below the water, and then we have an actual controller for the water itself. So the above water ambience controller is pretty basic. It's got a basic loop right here, and that is a 7.1 channel audio file, so that you get the full surround when you have those options enabled. So basically, once it starts the game, we activate the audio component, which has that sound, and I tell it to play and fade in. And then we start these two timers. We have two big timers here, the bird timer and the wind timer. The bird timer is set between random number picked between 0 seconds and 5 seconds. And when this triggers, it does a quick check to make sure that the player isn't underwater. If the player is underwater, it doesn't bother because you can't hear it. If they are underwater, it gets all actors that are birds, and for each one of them gives a 25% random chance for them to make a sound. And if that's true, I attach a sound. It's just a basic bird call for now, and then that plays at their current location. And then afterwards it goes back and picks another number between 0 and 5 and does it all over. The wind timer is a little bit more sophisticated. It still has the basic setup where it's picking a random number between 0 and 5, and then once that time hits, it triggers the event. This one does that same cameras underwater check, and then it does about a 60% chance that wind is going to spawn. And if that's true, it gets all actors. We have a bunch of target points placed throughout the world. I can show you right over here. We have a few. Primarily in between the trees for testing. Like here's a tiny guy right here. There's a few more scattered through these trees. So it actually gets all of them. And then I set a random wind intensity value. I don't believe I actually use it yet, but that's going to be for later. And then I'm going to get the length of this array, basically the number of all of those target points. I pick a random number between that and whatever number I select. That's the target point that gets selected. And I play a wind gust sound at that location, which I don't have anything set here. Wind gust. There we go. That explains a little bit. So I play a wind gust sound at that location. And then what I do is I remove that specific point from the list, and I pick another random one. So that way I'm not selecting the same target point twice. And then I move that component towards that location to give the feel that the wind sound is actually moving through the world. And then after that, I get all the actors nearby with the, I'm going to switch this to trees tag. And then I play a sound of like the branches wrestling within those trees. So when you put it all together, and keep in mind there's a bunch of placeholder sounds right now, you're going to hear these birds flying around, giving out some bird calls. It's all crows at the moment. And you're going to hear a few wind gusts, and you're going to hear the trees rustling. And ignore the footsteps for now. I'll let you know what those are. So you hear the bird calls. There's some rustling in the trees. I'll get in here so you can hear it better. And you can hear the wind moving through the trees. That gives an extra depth. Lots of placeholder sounds, so it doesn't sound quite right just yet, but the basic scripting is done. So now let's move over to the underwater class. This one's pretty basic right now. All I have right now is that it's setting a timer. This is, I believe, every like 30 times a second. 30 or 60 times a second, I don't remember which. It checks the player's swim status, and based on whether or not the player is swimming, it'll either turn on or off the water ambient controller. That way I'm not running it when the player is running around on land. It saves on performance and voice count. So basically all I have really set up here is an update that happens when the player camera enters the water. It basically tells this controller to either fade in the ambience if the camera enters the water, or fade out the ambience if the camera leaves the water. So when you fade in, so when the camera enters the water, it plays a transition sound 2D, which is just a splash and some bubbles. And then it fades this loop ambience in, while the above water ambience fades out. So really this sound here is just playing to hide the crossfade between above and below water. And that's going to be the same when the player exits the water. There's going to be some other stuff here later, but at the moment, that's all I've got for now. So I'll show you that in the works. So we're above the water. We're above the water still. And we're swimming, but our camera is still above the water. So that's where we're listening from. And then when we enter the water, you can hear the bird calls are still a little iffy. I gotta fix. But you can see that there is the splash sound, the basic loop for underwater is in, and I need to fix the bird calls, but those should turn off. But when I go back above, we're back in the above water ambience. All I need right now is a few splash, like emerging sounds to mask that transition better. But that'll come in time. So this water controller, this is actually for just objects in general, entering and leaving the water. So this event graph here. So basically, all this is doing for now is just getting the level name on start. I don't really need this. I had an idea to use this, but I haven't executed anything yet. But basically, whenever something hits the water surface, it triggers this event here, where it receives the velocity of the object entering the water, the location it's hitting the water, a check to see if that object entering the water is the player, and then the actual object that's itself. So like this would be the player actor object if it was the player, or it could be a tin can object. But first things first, I calculate the speed at which it's entering the water, and then I set an intensity value based on that speed. I check if it's the player, and if it's the player, I go in here and I play the splash sound, specific sound cue for low, medium, and high based on that velocity, and it plays where the player is entering the water. And then it's the same sort of deal for the objects. I do a few checks here. I actually get the physical material of the object, so you can set it to be like metal or wood or glass, and based on that, in theory, I can actually play specific audio files to give it a better feel that a glass object entered the water or a wooden object entered the water. But that's all that this does for now. At some point, probably after the demo is out, I'm going to try to work in so that the actual material, the shader that the water is using, the calculations for when waves come in, waves come out, if I can get those values sent to this controller, that way I can create wave sounds that are synced to the actual material so it looks and sounds like a wave is coming in. But right now, this is all I have for that. This right here is my absurdly complicated character footstep system. So these are attached to animations, basically. So at like a specific frame in an animation, it'll trigger this event. So like once the frame where the foot hits the ground, it will trigger this. It's going to check if it's the left or right foot, which I set manually. And then if it's the left foot, it finds the socket on the player. This is going to be where the footstep sound plays from. So footstep sound socket left is attached to the left foot, and then the right will be attached to the right foot. But then I cast to the third person character, where I get the floor surface type. So in the character blueprint, there's what's called an IK update. This is used for animations to make sure that the foot isn't clipping through the floor. And they basically do a trace and get information on where the surface is located. But I can actually pull the physical material type from that same information. And I'm doing that right here. I'm getting what type of surface it is. Is it wood? Is it water, sand, dirt? And I'm using that to select which list of footstep sounds that I'm going to be pulling my footstep sound from. So sand dry, sand wet, concrete, dirt, water shallow, water deep, wood, glass. And that's all based on this surface type here. That gets set. It selects based on what the surface is. And then I do a whole bunch of math here. This basically is, it gets the speed of the player. It checks it between a range, basically from 0 to 1. And based on that range, it selects a section of that list. So here, for this. So you'll see over here, this is my list of sand, dry footstep sounds. And the idea is that the first 5 objects here are going to be walking footsteps. And then the next 5 would be jogging, and the next 5 would be running. And based on the percentage of speed, based on the player's max speed, which is when he's at a full sprint, you would select between these values randomly, but determined based on velocity. So if they're walking, you're most likely going to be pulling from these here. If they're jogging, you'd be pulling from these here, which I have to assign yet. And then if he's at a full sprint, you'd be pulling from these footsteps here. And then I just play the sound. So there's a lot of deterministic properties here, plus some randomness to give it a more natural feel. I need to simplify this in a little bit better way, but that's the basic idea. So we put it all together with all these placeholder sounds, of course. So he's kind of in a slow jog, so you kind of hear those slower footstep sounds. But when you go to full sprint, these are my placeholder sounds that were at the bottom of that list. That way, the player footstep sounds that they're playing scale with the speed of the player. So that's all I've got so far. Now I've really got to put in all the actual sounds, doing a bunch of recording, mixing, stuff like that. Should be done this week, so I'll probably post another video when it's all done. Cool. Thanks for watching.